a real pleasure to be here, and it's a very brave thing that the organisers have done. I apologise about all the messages about food, about speaking as a Brit, I feel quite alienated and almost to the point of where I feel violated that you didn't have gin. There are lots of other things I could say, but I'm not one to complain. But it's really great to be here and, you know, hearing Megan, and I agree with every word that Megan said. You know, it's so clear that we have to be better than we are, but that there are some women who speak out and really who don't get enough support, and who are on the front line, and some of them are here, and I think that we need to consider whether or not it's worth being half-hearted about anything, about being weekend feminists or keyboard warriors, or it's a bit like being a little bit pregnant. It's impossible to do, because we know that if we speak out one word against the sex trade, for example, or religious fundamentalism, or the transgender madness, and they are the three issues that I think we can put together and explain more why, then we're going to be monstered. Having said that, we need to choose our battles, and we need to choose which hill we're going to die on. But you know, Megan, she's quite, I think, modest. You know, she talks about how she's had a little bit of bother. Our lovely Elizabeth said, and I know you were complimenting her, that, you know, Megan doesn't care, she gets all this shit. But actually, we all care when we get this shit. It's not acceptable that Megan had her job threatened. A job that paid her peanuts, where she had to work with a load of bellends. This is a British word for wanker. Which is a British word for man. It's not okay that she was called transphobic and racist because she said something feminist and had a petition of thousands going after her job, her home, her livelihood. She does care. It kept her awake at night. It keeps Gail Dines awake at night, Sheila Jeffries awake at night, keeps me awake at night. We do not have thick skin. We don't. The more shit we get, the worse it affects us. So we have to stop thinking that this stuff doesn't affect those of us that get the worst of it. And we have to start thinking, share it out a little bit. Megan said the one thing that I came all this way to say, so I may as well go and sit down and start drinking wine. She said that if we're not robust about this, if we don't look out for each other, if we don't speak out, it's the women who have the least privilege that will be affected. So I just want to start by giving a little example of that, which has nothing to do with prostitution, or the transgender issue, or religious fundamentalism. But it's a job that I did as a journalist. I went undercover all the way to Colorado, to the Bible Belt. I was posing as a woman called Jo, who was a very unhappy lesbian. I'd been raised, my cover story went, as a Christian. When my mum found out I was a lesbian, I was thrown out of the family, and every relationship I had, everyone, had gone terribly wrong. And I knew that it was because I was going against Jesus, who I loved. I actually had to get a woman who was raised Christian to tell me about hymns and praying and stuff like that. You should have seen the outfit that I wore. Yeah. The American tan tights were a thing of beauty, but I did pass as a very good Christian. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, I got my story. It was horrendous. I went to a gay conversion therapy. I'm here to tell you it didn't work. It was a waste of that newspaper's money. But I did get a very good story. And my story was this. Everybody cares, well, gay men and their liberal supporters care about this conversion therapy business because they recognise it's inhumane. And how gay men explain it as a monstrosity is by saying, we're born this way, we can't help ourselves, you should tolerate us, it's the Christian thing to do, the right thing to do, you should accept us. But I find that almost as abhorrent as the anti-gay bigotry that underpins this conversion therapy bullshit. The reason why I did the story was to say, look at how women are targeted by these so-called therapists. It's not just gay men. And when I came back, I filed my story, and it was a good story, and the editors told me that they couldn't run it unless I added the line, we're born this way, therefore we can't be changed. And I refused. What would have been the point? So that was pure cowardice, because the editor knew that the gay men would come after her in the same way that the gay men had gone after Cynthia Nixon. Do you remember her?
Yes. Yeah.
So she said, I was straight, and I'm now a lesbian, and I know which one I prefer. And she was piled upon as though she had said, kill all gays. Because how dare people say it's a choice? Well, actually, people don't say it's a choice. Lesbians say it's a positive privilege to be a lesbian. Now, on the other hand, I mean, I do think that sexuality is you know, very ingrained, etc. But the reason why I think it's important that we stick to our guns about this is that we don't want to be the feminists that are tolerated, do we? We want to be the feminists that can be proud. And I wanted that story to go out, which it did eventually in a book I was writing, because of the young women, the working class women, the women of colour, the women who are disenfranchised, the women who are lesbians and are told that they are tolerated. So if we don't stand there and say, we are who we are because we are proud of this, because it's a great alternative to heterosexuality, then how can we ever feel pride in who we are and what we are? Now, obviously, my main work is against the sex trade. And we have to have a think on the theme of bravery about how difficult it is for those of us that choose to do this work in exposing the horrors of the sex trade, but how much worse it is by a million miles for the survivors of the sex trade that do this work, who are called liars and fantasists. And then we have to think about why none of us are doing work explicitly on pornography, except for Gail Dimes, who is in the room, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would appear that she's been alone for some time. That most of us that work on the sex trade have to be reminded by Gail to even mention pornography. And then we have to think about how almost impossible it is for women who have been abused in pornography to speak out as survivors. Because of the stigma, because of the punishment, because of being on record, on film. And then we can do a 360-degree turn and think, Okay, so those of us that aren't pornography or sex trade survivors and have a choice about whether we do this work or not, why aren't more of us doing it? I mean, we're not in this for the salary. Let's be honest. It's a great community. I live and breathe feminism and have ever since, as a teenager, I got involved, but there's easier ways to live your life, isn't there? I mean, there's nothing better, but there are easier ways. So seeing as we're in it anyway, why don't we actually just do that little bit more? We can't take relentless batterings and stand by and watch other feminists say, I'd lose my job, and it's a good job. Or half of my friends would disown me. Or I'd get shit for this. Shit for it? They've got no idea. They literally cannot imagine the shit that you get being public and standing up and saying the things we all know are true, all of us. And that's why I decided to write my book on the sex trade. Because there were feminists who would take the coward's way out. And the liberal way is the coward's way out. You know, the reality about the sex trade is almost too much to bear, isn't it? So how much easier is it if we think, oh, it's okay for the women, if they're not being pimped or beaten every day. Some of them do earn good money. For some women, it's empowering. Well, the women are telling us this. Who are we to speak out against that? Which brings me to point one. And one of the main reasons I decided to put a book together to show the evidence that contradicted the mythology. The women that are standing up and saying, this is great work, we enjoy it, we earn a fortune. They're in one of two camps. They're either the tourists, so the ones who are white, middle-class, privileged women, probably doing a PhD or writing a book about it, or intending to write a book, who wiggle their asses at a webcam, or sit on the end of a phone sex line, turn the odd trick, as tourists. The others, they're there representing the industry. They may believe, they may be telling you their truth at that moment, that this has not harmed them. But drill down into their definition of being a sex worker, and you'll usually find out that they're not being prostituted for money. And I used to be terrified when one of those women stood up in a meeting like this, or challenged me on the media, and said, how dare you tell me what to do with my body? Because it's one of those things that we have a knee-jerk response to, don't we? Well, I'm not frightened anymore. Because I just started to say to the women, could you tell me please exactly what aspect of sex work you're involved in? And when they were outraged, I'd say, I'll tell you about my journalism, no problem. Why won't you tell me about your prostitution? Give me some detail. Tell me what the sex is like. Because they never talk about the sex, ever. It's the money, it's the choice, it's the I prefer it to McDonald's, never the sex. But we talk about operational aspects of our jobs. The mundane, the unpleasant, the fun. Excuse me. And the second reason I decided to write this book is because everywhere I went in the world, doesn't matter who I was talking to, except for committed, radical feminists like us, and you asked, what can we do to separate the problems of the sex trade from the sex trade itself? How can we alleviate the clear damage? And they would say, legalise it, make it safer for the women. No. And when you asked what they meant, or they'd say decriminalise, because legalisation became, you know, a bad word because it clearly had failed. When you asked how, why, tell me more, they wouldn't know what to say. They would tell you what somebody else had said. And this included feminists. And the liberal feminists who don't want to upset the dudes. They don't want to upset the dudes, which is why they are so full of shit about the transgender issue also, and about religious fundamentalism, in particular the full face veil, which sisters of mine back home in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, who were born into Muslim families, are campaigning against. But you've got white liberals saying, no, 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 it's a choice, it's empowering, it's Islamophobic to speak against it. And it's interesting, isn't it, that these three issues, political Islam, the sex trade, and transgenderism, all benefit men.